Imagine waking up in a world where the switch of American entry into World War II just never flips. We're jumping right into a bleak alternate reality of 1941. The map is burning, Europe is falling, and the United States? Well, it remains officially completely outside the conflict. What if Pearl Harbor never happened? What if Washington just refused to go all in? Today on The Explainer, we're standing at the edge of a completely different world where the final outcome of history hung by a single thread. Let's dive into it.
Where the roar of American factories never became the heartbeat of the Allied war machine. Just think about that for a second. Without the United States, there are no American soldiers landing in North Africa. There's absolutely no D-Day. There's no massive flood of tanks, planes, fuel, food, medicine, and steel crossing the Atlantic to rescue an exhausted Europe. We're basically setting the stage for a much darker, much longer conflict. The oceans stay darker for longer, and the battlefields, they burn hotter and deeper. If the USA had just stayed out, who would have stopped the nightmare?
Section 1. Europe's longer, bloodier war, and the first casualties of American absence.
Now, to really understand what changes, we have to look at Europe. On one hand, in our real timeline, we see this explosive American rescue. Britain got ships, food, and radar, while the Soviet Union relied heavily on an American Lend-Lease lifeline for aviation fuel and literally hundreds of thousands of trucks. But in this alternate nightmare, German submarines achieve unchecked U-boat dominance. Every single lost cargo ship starves Britain just a little bit faster. Meanwhile, the Soviet struggle becomes incredibly desperate without that American logistics backup. It turns into a drawn-out, bloody slog just for basic survival.
And the ripple effects of that slog are terrifying. Without D-Day, Nazi Germany gets to fight on fewer fronts. If the war drags on like this, we face the very serious possibility of a negotiated stalemate. That means Germany retains far more power, and the ideological poison of fascism remains deeply entrenched across the continent for decades. It's a really unsettling thought.
Okay, moving on to Section 2, the extended Pacific Empire and Asia's dark shadow.
Let's shift our focus across the globe for a minute. Without America acting as the primary naval hammer in the Pacific, Japan's trajectory completely changes. Look at 1941. Their aggressive expansion just continues unchecked. By 1943, without an American fleet rolling across the ocean to stop them, Japan deepens its imperial grip on China and Southeast Asia. Fast forward to 1945. There are no atomic bombs, and there's definitely no sudden surrender. Instead, the Pacific War stretches out into a chaotic, long-term imperial struggle, evolving under a really heavy shadow of regional and anti-colonial chaos.
Which brings us to Section 3, a fractured nuclear age and stumbling into the atomic era.
So, here's a massive question. If the USA stays out, who enters the nuclear age first? In our actual timeline, America's entry is what really drove the Manhattan Project. That was an effort so unbelievably massive it cost over $2 billion. A price tag that was pretty much impossible for war-torn European nations to afford while they were fighting for their lives. Without that American urgency, development just becomes this delayed, uncontrolled experiment. Does Germany continue their research? Do Britain or the Soviets get there first? The first atomic weapons could have easily appeared in a post-war world that was already totally fractured, making nuclear history vastly more dangerous.
Now let's look homeward. Section 4, the lost American century and the ripple effect at home.
So what actually happens to America itself if it never enters the war? Well, we basically lose what we call the American century. We'd see a significantly slower economic recovery from the Great Depression, mostly because those factories never turn into giant engines of mass military production. The civil rights movement, it sees a diminished acceleration without the urgency of the WWII campaign. We also see a severely delayed integration of women into heavy industry and manufacturing. Plus, there's a much slower pace of innovation in things like aviation, medicine, and early computing. The invisible wires that connect our modern life, they simply aren't strung the same way, without that wartime push.
I really love this quote. Remove the furnace and the metal cools differently. Think about it. Total war acted like a giant furnace that forced massive, profound changes that were just waiting in the shadows of American society. Without the intense heat of that conflict, sure, the country might still change, but it happens much later, much slower, and under entirely different pressures. The America we know today, quite literally, wouldn't exist.
Section 5, a darker post-war world and the global power vacuum. If the United States stays out, we are left staring at an incredible global power vacuum. Just look at how this breaks down.
In Europe, instead of a clean, structured rebuild, we see a confusing patchwork of weakened states and entirely unresolved borders. Over in Asia, it's an unstable, multipolar nightmare of collapsing colonial administrations and drawn-out guerrilla wars. And the United States? It remains wealthy, sure, but it completely lacks the global moral authority and financial dominance it gained in our timeline. In this reality, there's no United Nations, no NATO, no Marshall Plan. The entire world becomes wildly fragmented and highly prone to local wars.
So, what's the most crucial number to remember in this alternate post-war reality? It's 0. That's 0 stabilizing giants left in the center of the global system. Without American participation, there is absolutely no single referee to help impose a framework after the gunfire finally stops. There is no tidy rebuilding process. It's just a much shakier planet trying desperately to climb its way out of a trench.
All of this naturally leads us to the ultimate question. Would the Allies still win? Well, maybe. Britain and the Soviet Union were of course capable of immense sacrifice, but without that unstoppable American industrial engine, victory arrives much, much later, and it costs infinitely more in human lives. The absence of America doesn't magically create peace, it just creates a much longer, more agonizing inferno.
Removing one piece of history doesn't just leave a neat little gap, it brings down the whole structure. Change one link, and the entire chain becomes something completely else. The real question isn't just what happens if America stayed out. It's how many things in our everyday world only exist because they didn't. How many millions of lives were saved because one country crossed an ocean at the exact right moment. If this exploration sparked your imagination, make sure to subscribe to The Explainer for more mind-bending analysis. We'll keep exploring the fascinating roads history never took. See you next time.